China is a command and control economy, and we and our allies will neither be commanded nor controlled.
China has a little bit of leverage right now. You know, they could disrupt the world economy. Yeah, I guess if they shut it completely off. But then it would hurt them more than it hurts us. So we don't think they're gonna really do it.
The Australians had been looking to meet with the US president now for over 9 months, but they're uneasy about the meeting when it finally happened, as most leaders are these days, since they have no clue when the president may decide to do a Zelensky with them, as the famous interaction in February in the Oval Office is now called. Lucky for the Australian Prime Minister that Donald Trump decided to have a go not at him, but at the former Australian Prime Minister and now Ambassador to the United States, Kevin Rudd, who is, by the way, a China expert. But in case you didn't see the video, I want to share it with you.
Asked her to say something bad about it? Don't tell me. I don't. Where is he? Is he still working for you?
Yeah.
You said bad?
Before I took this position, Mr. President.
I don't like you either.
It's good to be reminded again and again how a superpower can become a laughingstock of the world and why leadership is so important. This was done at the announcement of what officials in Canberra have hailed as the most significant economic partnership with Washington in over a decade. Australians have been desperate to get into Donald Trump's good books. They've been hit with a baseline tariff for 10% despite having a trade deficit with the United States. They've also been hit with the 50% on aluminum and steel tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed across the world. And most importantly, they were worried about what was going to happen on the AUKUS commitments from the United States, which the Trump administration had put in review. But they came at an opportune moment for Washington. China had just imposed those rare earth mineral controls, so the Australians came with an offer, tailor-made for the art of the deal president. Its vast mineral riches for the future. He positioned his country as a reliable supplier of the materials outside China to gain leverage on trade talks and a defense partnership, whilst reminding Donald Trump of the value of a close ally like Australia in countering China's influence. Trump, we know, cares little for allies, often calls most of them as being freeloaders, so he hadn't given Australia much time until this point. And the Australians were worried that the America First policies would threaten that AUKUS partnership that had been announced under the Biden administration in 2021. It's a $250 billion trilateral security deal in which Australia buys the United States nuclear-powered submarines in 2032 and then builds a new submarine class with the United Kingdom. Now, luckily for them, since it involves them handing over cash to the United States, Trump has now given it the go-ahead, saying it was full steam ahead. The Australians also promised that their pension funds will increase investments in the United States to over $1.4 trillion by 2035. That's almost $1 trillion higher than current levels. Now, as with most Trump-era deals, the headlines come first and the details come later as to what was actually agreed. And as you know, we often hear different versions of it. President Trump, in his characteristic bombastic style, said that in a year's time, we'll have so much critical minerals and rare earths that you won't know what to do with them. However, the New York Times has also published an article and reported that Mr. Albanese's office has said that the agreement with Washington was not legally binding or enforceable. So it may be another one of those deals that leaders have learned to say to keep President Trump happy. Australia offers the United States and other countries around the world lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. These are the metals that power both the Teslas and the Tomahawks. The United States is in return offering financing, some long-term purchase commitments and guarantees, and a seat for Australia at that reshoring table. And there's not many people there so far. It's led to an immediate jump in the Australian rare earth companies. But the numbers under discussion are underwhelming at best for any real competition to China's control of the sector to be set up. They're talking of $8.5 billion of pipeline of projects, which are going to be discussed between the two countries, investing around $3 billion by the end of the next 6 months. This is including in the Arafura Rare Earths Nolans project in the Northern Territory of Australia, which once it's operational is said will produce around 5% of all global rare earths. The United States Department of War, and I'm going to call it that because it's so funny, instead of Pentagon, the United States Department of War will also be investing in the construction of a gallium separation plant in Western Australia. Now, this is a planned AUKUS plant which would produce around 100 metric tons of gallium a year, or around 10% of the global supply when it's fully online. China currently accounts for around 99% of global gallium output, and securing new sources of this mineral was a priority for many Western policymakers after China introduced the export restrictions in 2023 on this particular mineral. Just an FYI, the Chinese announcement came after the United States and the Netherlands tightened restrictions on semiconductor technology exports to China, including those advanced chip-making equipment, as well as that lithography equipment from the Dutch company ASML. Now, do check out that Nexperia vlog I just did as to what the Dutch have recently done again to a Chinese company. I will put a description below as well. Now, ironically though, these rare earths produced in Australia would still need to be transported internationally somewhere for metallization, followed by magnet making, because Australia does not currently have the manufacturing processes. China is the world's dominant buyer of materials that go into the production of these high-grade magnets, which it then sells in the final product form and exports out. Now, because they've taken US money on that pretext of national security, they won't be able to sell these to Chinese either. However, the numbers being mentioned in the deal of the century are pittance compared to what's actually going to be needed if these countries are seriously interested in overcoming Chinese dominance in the industry. And even more than money is that to develop the mines, the projects, and the mid-downstream processing of ores, it's going to take many, many years, as well as weaning off those Western buyers from Chinese suppliers. Now, financially, Australia could easily fund these projects alone. The country's mining sector is among the world's most profitable, with exports exceeding over 400 billion Australian dollars annually. Yet, by bringing the United States into them as a co-investor, Canberra is transforming a domestic strength into basically an instrument of alliance between the two countries. It's a calculated gesture which is designed to keep the American partnership anchored in the country. And it's not the first time that Australia has inserted itself into another country's rare earth minerals war with China. In 2010, when Beijing cut off supplies to Japan over a territorial dispute, Tokyo then invested heavily in an Australian mining company to secure an alternate source and reduce its dependence on Chinese supply of rare earths. In fact, Tokyo has been the first country that has vocally supported Treasury Secretary Besant's claim that China was holding a bazooka to the rest of the world over rare earth materials. Katsunobu Kato, the Japanese finance minister, recently said in Washington that Japan is deeply concerned about the extensive export restrictions on rare earths announced by China last week, and the G7 should unite in dealing with the issue. So will this deal, which is being touted as a cornerstone for future industrial security, give the United States that peace of mind from China's dominance in rare earth minerals? Or are the Australians dangling a pie in the sky hope? What's the reality versus fantasy? What do the Australians actually want from the United States? And what's the role of the AUKUS in this? Let's dive in deeper. The goal is clear: to build an alternative trusted Western supply chain for the materials that power the modern world. Okay, so while this all sounds great, what's the reality? Australia is estimated to have at least 5% of the world's reserves of rare earths, and it accounts for roughly 8% of global production. It sits on some of the world's richest reserves of critical minerals, including lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and the rare earth elements, such as the neodymium and the dysprosium. Now, according to the US Geological Survey, Australia has around 5.7 million tons of rare earth oxides, and that places it amongst the top 5 globally. But by contrast, China has 70% of global rare earth minerals. It has 44 million metric tons of reserves, followed by Brazil with 21 million and India's 7 million. In Australia, most of these resources are concentrated in the Western Australian parts and the Northern Territory, where it has projects like the Mount Weld mine, which is owned by the Australian company Lynas Rare Earths. It ranks amongst the highest grade rare earth deposits outside China. Now, Australia also leads in lithium production, supplying roughly half of the world's lithium output, which is critical for EV batteries and renewable energy storage. Yet despite this, Australia has traditionally just extracted and not refined metals. The country exports the majority of its raw ore for processing abroad and primarily to China, which dominates that midstream stages of separation and refining. The biggest issue with rare earths is not about the mining footprint, but rather it's the processing, which is a dirty business. It involves extraction, leaching, thermal cracking, and refining, many of which produce that radioactive components. And it's this cost and environmental degradation which has made many countries, Western countries in particular, ship these products out to China to process them. And that's why China now has a monopoly on the processing. And it's because of these cost and environmental constraints that, for example, Lynas takes its feedstock from near Kalgoorlie in Australia, where I said its mine existed, and it transports them all the way to Malaysia to facilities that it's set up there, where it is the first company outside China to produce commercial quantities of dysprosium, one of the most heavy rare earth elements. Now, the company, due to national security concerns in recent years, with government help, is trying to bring back some of that processing and has set up a separation plant in that region, Kalgoorlie. Now, where Australia provides the raw material, China has been providing the industrial muscle. So over the past 3 decades, China's built a vertically integrated rare earth ecosystem, one that controls not just the mining, but also the chemical separation, the refining, the alloying, the magnet manufacturing, and that transforms that raw ore into a usable technology or product. Now, as of 2025, China still accounts for about 60 to 70% of global rare earth mining and more than 85% of refining and processing capacity. The US sources over 70% of its rare earth imports from China, while the EU relies on China for about 98% of its supply. Cities in Inner Mongolia or in the Xinjiang province of China have become the world's undisputed centers for this rare earth magnet production. They're supplying essential components for smartphones, electric vehicles, and advanced defense systems across the world. Now, this level of achievement reflects decades of state-guided industrial planning, policy, supported by investments in infrastructure and research. Ironically, given the Western complaints, it was China's dominance in this field which created the efficiency and that scale which have kept prices low and the supply generally reliable, so that those cheaper iPhones, phones in general, cars, EV cars, batteries, and many other products that were used in the West, and it was possible to reach the masses at that low price point. Yet those very prices is what has made it difficult for other nations to compete without heavy subsidies. Now, the West's renewed interest in critical mineral security stems largely from their structural reality. It's not coming from a sudden shortage, but it's coming from a recognition that value creation happens where refining and manufacturing occur. They know it. This is their story. Where raw materials are dug, you don't make the money. Remember the US Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich conference at the beginning of this year. We expected that the developing countries would stay poor and work at the bottom end of the chain, while we became rich because we did the value-added work. Now, I'm paraphrasing his words.
The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poor countries made the simpler things. It turns out that the geographies that do the manufacturing get awfully good at the designing of things.
But that's basically what his thoughts were. Now, even with the new deals like the one being discussed between the US and Australia, China will remain the core hub of rare earth processing for at least the next decade. Its existing infrastructure, the technological know-how, and established global customer base gives it that head start that's going to take years and billions of dollars in investment for any rival to match. So the new US-Australia framework should therefore be seen not so much as an immediate challenge to China's dominance, but rather as a hedge against over-concentration by one country. Australia's own processing capacity remains limited, and American firms have struggled to scale up cost-effective refining operations. Now, even if the US and Australia succeed in producing refined rare earths, they will still face a shortfall in magnet manufacturing, where China continues to hold an overwhelming advantage. Therefore represents not a replacement, but basically a strategic diversification, an attempt to create redundancy in global supply chains to ensure that the West has at least one credible alternative if those geopolitical tensions ever restrict access to China's industrial ecosystem. Now, that's obviously fair enough. Competition is always good anyway. Now, coming to the AUKUS. When it was announced in 2021, it symbolized a deep technological and defense bond amongst the US, the UK, and Australia, most notably through the sharing of nuclear-powered submarine technology. However, the return of Donald Trump to the presidency introduced a note of uncertainty. Now, Donald Trump, we know, has often questioned the value of those long-standing alliances and told his partners to shoulder more financial responsibility. Earlier this year, the deal came under the spotlight after the Trump administration said that they were going to review the details to ensure that it fits with his America First agenda. And that raised concerns that Australia may not be able to buy US submarines to replace its own aging fleet. However, now that the Trump has seen the transactional value of the deal, he's given it his full steam ahead, thumbs up. Australia is now also being told to purchase around $1.2 billion in Anduril's unmanned underwater vehicles and is spending another $2.6 billion in the Apache helicopters. For Australia, heavily invested in that submarine program and the industrial base that it supports, the risk is very clear. If the US had disengaged, that AUKUS would have lost momentum and it would have left Australia stranded between its commitments and its capabilities. So this minerals agreement basically serves a second function. It reties that economic knot between Canberra and Washington. It's offering resource access and the stability of a trusted supplier that Australia provides that Trump administration with an attractive economic deliverable. It's a concrete win for him in industrial reshoring and energy security.
Analysts are describing this as a temptation package, a way of keeping the U.S. economically engaged in the region by appealing to Trump's domestic priorities of job creation and supply chain resilience. For Australian policymakers, it's a pragmatic move. If Washington's attention can be anchored through tangible investments, the risk of political drift within AUKUS is reduced. In essence, the minerals partnership acts as a new layer of strategic glue, binding economic and security interests together in a way that is harder for any administration, even a skeptical one, to easily unwind. China has protested, saying it amplifies risk of nuclear proliferation and that they oppose bloc confrontation, which of course they know is aimed at them. Australia is once again performing a balancing act. Economically, it's intertwined with China, yet strategically and culturally, it's bound to the United States and the Western axis, and sees itself as the protector of their whims and desires. China is Australia's largest trading partner, accounting for roughly 1/3 of its total exports, including vast volumes of iron ore, coal, and increasingly lithium. Even as Canberra deepens security cooperation with Washington, it cannot ignore the gravitational pull of China's market. Many of the same critical minerals that the United States now seeks from Australia already flow to Chinese buyers, who offer stable long-term contracts and established refining networks. For Australian producers, these relationships are lucrative and dependable. For policymakers, they are politically sensitive. The minerals deal with Washington, therefore, is not an act of economic separation from Beijing, but rather an attempt to diversify without decoupling. This strategy, however, carries inherent risks. Beijing has historically viewed moves by U.S. allies to redirect supply chains as a signal of strategic alignment rather than mere commercial adjustment, which we, of course, know that it isn't. Any perception that Australia is facilitating an American effort to bypass Chinese industry could invite economic retaliation, something Canberra has experienced before during previous trade disputes over barley, wine, and coal. In this sense, the minerals deal represents both an opportunity and a gamble, an effort to cement Australia's value to Washington, while hoping that Beijing interprets the gesture as pragmatic economics rather than geopolitical defiance. Good luck to them getting that. For Washington, the partnership is both strategic and symbolic. The U.S. has been searching for reliable suppliers of rare earths since the early 2000s. After domestic refining capacity dwindled, Australia's stable governance, proximity to Southeast Asian trade routes, and technical mining expertise make it a natural partner. So for the country, it's a step toward rebuilding industrial resilience. However, even with this deal, American industries will continue sourcing refined materials, directly or indirectly, from Chinese suppliers for the foreseeable future. Do also watch the Rare Earth series I have in the playlist. It explains in detail why these are important. Share with me your thoughts and comments, and have a great day.